goal in this class is to seek ways in which we can, in a very godly way, do a better job with regards to grief management as well as that of comforting others. I want to look just at verse 3 once again from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul wrote, and we refer to this every Sunday because this is our foundational scripture. This is upon which all of what we're trying to accomplish is based. That is, that blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort. We closed out our class actually last week with a couple of scriptures that seem a little bit difficult for some of us unless we really look at the depth of the writers, both that in the Psalms as well as we're going to look in the New Testament. With regards to the issue that death should be viewed as a blessing. And that's just for those of us who are left behind. When we do lose a loved one, it's very difficult. Many times, if we don't view this from a proper perspective, it's very difficult to really take that at heart and say, well, yes, death is a blessing, but it's in the context of that death of a Christian, of a faithful child of Christ, and knowing that that individual, at least for the time being, is better off. Psalms 116:15, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godly ones. So God used that as precious. The goal for that godly person is now being reached and accomplished. And likewise in Proverbs, in the 14th chapter, verse 32, there it says, the wicked is thrust down by his wrongdoings. But in contrast now, he talks about the wicked, and then it says, but the righteous has a refuge when he or she dies. And that ought to give us comfort when we indeed have lost a child of God. And we should view it as a blessing. I of all the years I've been here at Central, and I've brought this up numerous times, I have never been allowed to lead singing. Dan will never get me up to lead singing. There must be some reason for that. I don't know why. But nevertheless, even though, and there is a good reason, by the way, so I don't plan on me doing so. But nevertheless, I love songs, and one of my favorite songs is a song that's entitled God's Family. And there it talks about it, and thinking about comfort, thinking about the loss of a dear loved one from this earthly life, and then the words that are contained in this song are so strengthening and so important. There it says we're a part of the family that's been born again. That's all of us. We're all a part of that family. And when we all get to heaven, we're part of God's family. It's actually in our songbook and on number 855, where again it starts off, we're a part of the family that's been born again. But he goes on to say, and this gets to some of the points we were talking about last week, is sometimes we laugh together, sometimes we cry, and sometimes we share together heartaches and sighs. Sometimes we dream together of how it will be when we all get to heaven, God's family. And I know for all of us, we look forward to that, not meaning that we are necessarily wanting to leave this earthly life right now, but as Christians and as being a part of God's family, that just ought to give us a lot of comfort. And it certainly, whenever we sing that song, it just really lifts me up. I don't know what effect it has on you in that regard, but that's one of several songs that can really serve to be such a source of encouragement and of comfort. Well, to change the subject and now look on the negative side, again talking about grief, as we had closed out our class last week, we looked at what had been identified by the, quote, professionals as there being various kinds of grief. You might be suffering and struggling with grief, while I'm suffering and struggling with grief, but our grief may be of different types, and for different reasons, and may have very different effects. And I wanted you to try to think about these and ponder these during this past week. Some of them, even the terminology and the way they're labeled is interesting, it's intriguing to me. That being that there is blocked grief. What is that? We're going to see if we can't find that out. There's what's called complicated grief. Then there is anticipated grief. And then this long word, and this is hard to get a handle on and even imagine how this could fit in, but we're going to see that it does. That being disenfranchised grief, long word. Then also there's what's referred to by the professionals as shadow grief, then accumulated grief, and then lastly we'll look at anxiety grief. Well, not lastly, anxiety grief, and then lastly children and grief. And certainly if we've ever seen occasions where a child lost a loved one, a parent, a sibling, or other family member, or just a friend, the way in which children may grieve, the way in which we as adults may try and to assist children in dealing with grief. I think we've got some pertinent points there. Ecclesiastes 3 verses 1 and 4, as we've referred to a couple of times previously, and there it says, there is an appointed time for everything. And there is a time for every event under heaven. There is a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. I want to just kind of put that on. How many of you are familiar with an individual? He's no longer living. He passed away a few years ago by the name of Yogi Berra. Everyone ever heard of Yogi Berra? He was a baseball player, New York Yankees catcher. Well, one of the things that Yogi Berra was noted for was what was referred to as his yogiisms. Anyone in here, can you think of a yogiism, a saying? I have a book. This is an interesting book I bought some time ago, and there's a reason for me bringing this up. Share with me a yogiism.
It ain't over till it's over.
It ain't over till it's over. Very right on target. What else? Any others?
Bob, something about 90% of the game is 50% mental or something. I don't remember the exact saying, but it's something about how he used 90% to be 50% of the baseball game.
That so happens to be one of the ones we're going to talk about. 90% is 50% mental. What about when you come to a fork in the road? What are you supposed to do?
Take it.
Take it. Yeah, well anyway, as I say, a lot of interesting quotes. You know, again, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. It ain't over till it's over. And also another one that's kind of famous is he says it's deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
But I want to share with you three others, and as it pertains to us, each one of us, as we endeavor, as we strive to try to deal with our own individual grief, as we endeavor, as we strive to be a comforter to others who are grieving. And we suggested this past week that going through the grief process, the grieving process can and indeed does better equip us, it better prepares us to be in a position, a more understanding position, if you please, of being a source of comfort to other people. And if we've been down that track one way or another, then we've sort of, what the Indians used to say, until you walked in my moccasins. Well, after we've already walked in those moccasins a little bit, it better prepares us to help someone else. So anyway, he says 90% of the game is half mental. Well, half mental certainly is fitting for me, but that's what he said. But the mental part is important. I mean, that's what we're striving to do spiritually as well as just emotionally and mentally as well as we strive to deal with this. Another is that you can observe a lot by watching. All you got, if you just watch, you can observe. I think that's something that a lot of us overlook a lot of times. And then the last one I've got on here, and I think it's really pertinent and it's particularly relevant to the challenge that I have of trying somehow to be a source of comfort and encouragement to others. And he says, always go to other people's funerals. Otherwise, they won't go to yours. Obviously, they won't. But going to funerals is really, really so important. Johnita, I don't see her in here this morning, but she shared with me some information that from the organization that she had worked with in hospice work, and a couple of articles. One of them says, let's keep the funeral tradition alive, and another is entitled, just always go to the funeral. Well, that's something that, until we've experienced it, it may not seem to be all that important, but how truly important and comforting and helpful it can be to someone who has lost a loved one. And so I think that's an important part of this journey and this challenge that we have of striving to be a comfort to others. Well, they pose a question. Now it's your turn. This is just a little bit off track, but I want to get your opinion as I think forward. Do you believe that in addition, and this is just a question in general, do you believe that in addition to the study that we're endeavoring to face right now and going through grief management and comforting the grieving, that there would also be a value in a study in caregiving of a loved one? Do you? How many in here have ever had to serve as a caregiver in one way or another for someone? Well, it's easy, isn't it? Piece of cake. It's not. We have, seriously, we have a lot within this congregation of individuals who right at this very moment, they're serving as caregivers for loved ones. And it's tough. It's very, very difficult. I just want your opinion. If we had a class or two on this particular subject, or if we tried to intermingle that within our study here, how many of you would have an interest in that? Just probably.
I think there's definitely value in that.
Well, okay. We'll keep that in mind and going forward. I think there's a value to it. I don't pretend to be the one who's capable of teaching and directing a class or series of classes, but that's, along with grief management, comforting the others, being a caregiver is really, really good.
That's one of the hardest unpaid jobs you'll ever have.
Yeah, that's so true. And it could be being a caregiver in many, many ways. Whether it's just an aged parent, someone who's dealing with physical health issues, or mental, Alzheimer's, cancer, whatever. Yes, very, very difficult. And it can be one of the hardest jobs ever. I appreciate it. Let's talk about blocked grief. We'll get back to the topic. Blocked grief, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. I'm not going to make a lot of additional commentary, which I know that's going to be hard for you to believe. But in order to try to get through these different types of grief, Grief is often blocked because people are so tied up, here we go, in caregiving, that they simply do not have the time to grieve. Sometimes also finances, tragedies, or urgencies can keep one from grief work. And thus, we would view that as having had that grief process, that grief management that we're striving to be prepared for, that can kind of block it. There are any number of things and ways that can do that because of being diverted for caregiving, because of financial problems, other issues. Block grief is also when you experience a traumatic or sudden loss. Grief then can become inhibited or blocked. If it's something that was totally unexpected, occasionally, and we're going to talk about anticipated grief, we have occasionally where we know that time is coming, and we can sort of mentally and physically prepare for it. But other times, grief can occur just because it was something that was traumatic and sudden, unplanned for. You may decide consciously, or you may not consciously, I was going to say unconsciously, but not consciously, that you cannot accept your loss at that moment. And I think I'm just going to put this off, I'm going to postpone it. And you'll eventually move through the stages of grief, but by virtue of having this instance of this blocked grief, those stages that we're going to talk about can take even longer. Grief is also blocked when a person gets stuck in a particular state of mind, our mindset. And as we alluded even to the comment of Yogi Berra, our thought process, our memory and mind process is so very, very important in this. And if we're not careful, our grief can be blocked, and that can really cause additional challenges and problems for us as we strive to go forward with our lives. Grief is often blocked by the impossibility of re-entry. We can never get our lives exactly back where they were, where it was before, for any number of reasons that can cause that. And thus, because of not being able to have this re-entry back to what was our previous normal, when we talk about the new normal, that can result in blocked grief. Yet denial is the number one form of blocked grief. And again, for us he-man guys, so many times, we don't want to be a big sissy and act like we feel sorry for ourselves, or that we're sorry and sad at the loss of some individual or because of some event. And if we deny that again can result in blocked grief. Complicated grief. Grief is complicated when normal mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, simply does not work. If there is such a thing as normal mourning. We talked about mourning and how that can be a very important part, and it's not necessarily bad for it to be a part of the grieving process. But it sometimes is because of the nature of the death itself that can really complicate our grief process. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, some sort of a very, very difficult, challenging type of death can really thus complicate this process of grieving. Other times because of even regretful relationships with the deceased prior to the death. If I was having problems and negative issues with an individual, and that person later dies, and again we'll look at another aspect of that as well, but that can certainly complicate things from a professional analysis standpoint. Grief is sometimes complicated because of the demands made upon caregivers prior to the death of a loved one. And those demands can be significant. They truly can, as many, if not everyone in here knows. And that can certainly complicate the ultimate process of grieving. Grief can also be complicated because of family conflicts at the time. And how sad are those occasions when within the family unit, whether it's mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, children, grandchildren, that there ends up being conflicts between among them, and then one of the members of that family passes away. That certainly gives rise to a lot of potential complications in dealing with grief. So very, very sad, to say the least. But ironically, grief can even be complicated because of the circumstances, such as stress or poverty that was experienced by loved ones as a result of the death of a provider. If the individual who passed away within the family unit was the one who provided the sources of living, the income, and now that individual is no longer here and no longer available, without a doubt, in those occasions that proper arrangements and preparation have not been made, that can certainly open the door for complications and extreme difficulties. Does anyone have any comments on any of these as we go on? I don't want to just dominate it all. I've seen just from some facial expressions that I think some of these are hitting home, hitting the hearts of some of us who probably either certainly recognize it by having observed or possibly even experienced some aspects of these. Okay. Grief can be complicated by the lack of support that is received by the mourner from friends, family, or church members. Again, that imparts upon each one of us, upon Bob here, to try to be as great a source of support and comfort as I can be to someone who's suffering as a result of grief and the loss of a loved one. I'm certainly the last person in the world to be an example as to how it should be done, but it certainly makes me totally aware of the challenge and the responsibility that I have. But when there is that lack of support, particularly from family members and friends, and again, not limited, but within the church family as well, that can certainly complicate the grieving process.
I want to tell you and Ron that your visits to Don meant everything to him, and it made his day.
Well, he made my day, I'll tell you that. Seriously, I mean, but thank you for that. But again,
Ron was always checking up on us. I said Ron would check up on us every couple of days.
Yeah. Certainly. What a gift, and we have a lot. Yeah, as I said last week, and I'll use this term again, with regards to what I'll call my church family, you, everyone else here, I absolutely cherish my relationship with everyone in here because of just what you said, and how you serve to comfort and encourage me as I see you doing the same with others as well. And I know this room, we're talking to the choir here in this room. I really, truly wish that, and I've had a couple of you express this, that we wish that some of these subjects would be shared with other members of the congregation, some who don't feel a need, they're not going through the grieving process or whatever, yet it's just something that's so very, very important. because without that comfort and encouragement and support, it makes it so terribly difficult.
Well, Dick really enjoyed all the cards he got when, when everybody gets together and writes and send that envelope, he went through everyone.
Well, isn't that the truth? Monday Night for the Master is such a wonderful, wonderful ministry here, and all of us need to participate in that as much as we can. We never know what just one word of thought, one phone call, one card can mean to someone when we're struggling. And all of us who may have been in that situation and struggling and dealing with pain, we can understand that for sure. Thank you. What about anticipated grief?
Oh, I anticipated Dick's death from the time he was diagnosed for 3 years. I was crying every day.
Okay, so
I knew what was coming. I knew what he was going to go through.
you knew it and you anticipated it, and you said every day for 3 years.
Yeah.
You did it. And that's, again, when one becomes aware because of an illness or whatever the circumstances are, that it becomes seemingly apparent, most likely, that we're going to lose a loved one, whether that's going to be in the very near future or even extended out over a period of 2 or 3 years. Families, individuals, then can begin experiencing grief from the very time that they learn of a loved one's illness. When you go to that doctor and the doctor gives his determination, that can be so heartbreaking. That doesn't mean we give up at all.
Dick
We
was
never
always,
give up.
he was always so good to the doctors, and he told me to be nice too.
Absolutely. Be nice to the doctor. We're going to talk about anger in a minute.
One other point. One of the things in our finite human minds that we struggle with is we try to find equality in death. Or we try to understand how somebody can be taken and somebody left. But just like Ecclesiastes told us, there's a time appointed for all things. And if we are still here, right, we're going to suffer grief. We're going to lose loved ones. But God still has a job for us to do if He leaves us here. And that's one of the things that, that where our hope and our faith comes in, that will be realized someday. But in our minds, it's so hard to understand that whole, appointed time, that whole, why them, why not them, why me, why, and we really, really struggle with that as humans.
Absolutely. And as you say, when we're the one that is left behind, and what our mindset ultimately needs to get to, the point of, is that God's got a job for us. We've gone through this process of caregiving, of this anticipated grief, for whether it's a very, very short time or a lengthy time, and we lose that loved one. Ecclesiastes does say there is a time to mourn. There's nothing wrong with mourning and grieving, but there's a time also to be joyful, as we said, especially when we've lost a loved one who is a Christian.
One comment that I have is I denied until the very end. I just denied feeling what happened. They're going to get well, it's going to be okay. Until the end, I just denied that it's going to happen.
That's not that uncommon. I mean, and it's a difficult task, but you're human emotions in that regard. That denial is not that uncommon. And what we're trying to do in here is to at least identify that. And then we're going to try to see, well, when that does occur, what do I do? How do I cope and deal with that? Dan, were you going to say something?
Well, it struck me you've given a very long list, and we're going through these of different types of grief, and we've already seen people handling a similar situation differently. And that's going to happen. And I don't know, sometimes in my ignorance I go, I just don't understand, why you don't act the way I would. Right? Well, if I was going through that, this is how I would do it. And this is why you're going through all these, because so we can recognize that different people handle grief in different ways. And I don't think you're going to say this is the one that everybody in here ought to do. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to grieve. I do think it's important. But that puts the onus, if I'm grieving, Jack just needs to be patient with how I'm grieving, and it's just important to be there. Not necessarily saying this is how you ought to act, or this is, I don't understand why you are or are not doing this. But I mentioned earlier, we every time we study Job, we just rake his 3 friends over the coals. We are just brutal with them. I can't believe you're that type of friend. But if you notice what they did when they first came to Job, they came and they sat down with him and they didn't say a word for 7 days. 7 days.
Oh, that'd be hard for me.
It would be. But I think the point was that thing they got right. Until Job was ready to talk, they were just there. And I don't know the right thing. I didn't know the right thing to tell them. Okay? I didn't know the right thing to tell Brother Bob. And a lot of times, I just hope that by coming by and didn't have to say a word, but I don't know. I think this is really good, and try so hard. I need to try so hard. I don't understand why they don't. That's not.
Are you not familiar with the term "one shoe fits all"?
That's right.
One shoe certainly does not fit all. You're absolutely right. And that made me think of one other thing. And I cannot remember her name, but there's a famous lady poet. I don't know if she was a poet laureate, but talking about this encouraging someone who's hurting. And in it she says, it's not what you say, it's not what you do, it's how you make them feel. And that's the bottom line, as you say, and even in Job's instance, just to simply be there. And we worry about what we're going to say or what we're going to do, and unless we have a clear-cut identity of what to say or to do, just be there and let them know you love them and let them know that you care. I appreciate the comments. I don't want to interrupt if anyone has any thoughts. Continuing then, anticipated grief, individuals always experience a sense of their own finite nature and actually grieve their own mortality. Sometimes that's not unusual or uncommon necessarily, but particularly we see how others have lost their lives, and as we've gone through this grieving process, some can then begin even grieving their own anticipated death. Disenfranchised grief, very often, and think about this now, either divorce or family conflicts. We've alluded to this already. Divorce, family conflicts, and extended relationships block people or stop people from getting support at a time of death. They're simply not acknowledged as deserving intimate sympathy, even though they have known real love and are experiencing real grief. I read of an example of a young lady and her husband and her fiance. They were engaged to be married. They were very much in love. They'd already set the date for the marriage, and he was in a tragic car wreck and lost his life. Well, this certainly affected his bride-to-be, and she was very, very sad and grieving about it, but as far as the rest of the family was concerned, she wasn't part of the family. And they pretty well cut her out of the whole grieving process and was sort of, as we say, disenfranchised. So sad, and that can occur based upon a lot of things. In-laws often feel disenfranchised. You know, although they may have been closer to the deceased than the immediate family, they're often not viewed as hurting the same way, do not receive the same sympathy. We don't have time to go through a lot of discussion on that. With shadow grief, it's almost impossible to experience a new loss without having memories of other losses that we have experienced. We're not guaranteed that we're only going to go through this process once in a lifetime, are we? We may be reflecting back upon and have those memories of previous losses. That's what they refer to as shadow grief. And in some cases, people will cry during a worship service because they hear a certain song which was used at the funeral of a loved one. Grief is cumulative, and this multiple grief is what is meant by shadow grief. And I can tell you that has impacted me. There's a particular song, Dan, that you led at Diane's funeral. A beautiful song. When you lead us in it, and I want you to continue to do so, it brings tears to my eyes. And that's not uncommon, again, with those memories and the sensitivity that is involved with what is referred to as shadow grief. Cumulative grief, and there are some here who have suffered from this. When a person suffers several losses or several deaths close together, this can make it very difficult for the individual to recover from the one loss quickly because another happens. I'm not even through grieving the death. I've got another. It also occurs when there's not a healthy recovery from that first loss. And anxiety grief, most of us live with some level of anxiety. I've already told you my biggest anxiety is when that buzzer buzzes. But this anxiety may include fears, it may include stress, worry, or even generalized anxiety. Unfortunately, losing a loved one, especially a spouse, often leaves one in a stressful situation filled with unfinished business. And there are occasions when professional counseling is appropriate. And we need to recognize that and realize that there's nothing bad about seeking out professional help and counseling, particularly if we're dealing with this kind of anxiety and continued inability to work through our grief. In some cases, it also includes new financial obligations and less money, and that can block our processing of our grief, certainly. And then lastly, children in grief. It's hard for us adults to help children work through grief. Children will put a mask on many times when they've lost a dear loved one, and they'll, for a period of time, act as though nothing happened. And certainly it's different from one child to another, but until they've learned to manage the grief themselves, we as adults need to be very, very mindful, very cognizant of what's going on in their lives. Children are usually the best judge of their own needs, and wise parents will listen to them for guidance. Again, listening is 90% of it. And then although parents should listen to children, we still, as parents, whether a child is a very small, an infant, or whether it's a 50-year-old child, and I've got some of those, you should never, never exclude children from the overall grieving process. You can do all of this together many times. I'm going to close this out with just a reference to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Any of you ever heard of her? I think I brought this up. You've heard of her. Well, in 1969, she published a book. She was the author of a book on death and dying. And in this book, what she did was she described what she identified as the 5 stages of grief that people often experience. Her original research actually involved terminal illness, but her concepts were later applied to grief following the loss of loved ones. Well, we'll close out with this one. That this book has been widely accepted and it's considered by many, not by me, not that I'm an expert, but by many, and I think thus it's important to look at it, by many to be the ultimate authority on the subject of grief. And what she did was she identified 5 stages of grief. And you've got those on your outline, and that's what we want to focus on. And this is really going to get down to the nitty-gritty with regards to these so-called, and we're going to add some others to these 5 that she's identified. And just because she identified them, as I said, doesn't mean they're necessarily true. We'll just look at it. Obviously, you've got this. One is denial. Then there's anger. There's bargaining. Those are what she identified as 3 of the 5. And then also depression. And in addition, then, ultimately, acceptance. There are other experts in this field who have other areas as well, and we're going to talk about that and the sequence and how to deal potentially with each one of these. Yes?
I wanted to mention that when you're talking about disenfranchised grief, women having miscarriages are also considered a disenfranchised grief, and sometimes they don't get the recognition that those of us in here are going to, see that in younger people when they lose children and stuff.
That's so true, and that's what a challenge that is for us. I mean, we need to be more aware, more sensitive.
I mean, sometimes they grieve those losses for years.
Yeah. Appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. It's a challenge. We're not saying it's easy. The old saying, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Well, it's not easy, but everyone is going to do it. Every one of us in here, for sure. Thank you very much for your comments.